All right, here we go. We're at chapter number 49, and then hopefully next Wednesday we'll finish up with chapter 50, and then we'll literally close the book on that book of the Bible, Genesis, and we'll be done there. And so we've walked through a lot. We've discussed over the last several weeks about Joseph. We have looked at his story. We've looked at his relationship that he had with his brothers. We know what his brothers did to him, and we see that Joseph went through many other things after he was sent, obviously, into Egypt, and he was tempted by Potiphar's wife, and we know what happened there, and he was lied about, and we saw how that God was still continuing working behind the scenes in his favor, and we see later on how that he once again encounters his brothers and how that he wanted to see them come to a place of repentance, how he wanted to see their hearts forever changed. And so with that being said, his brothers did not know who that he was, but he knew who they were and wept many times. The scriptures tell us that a total of 4 different times that Joseph wept about his family. He wept on 3 different occasions with his brothers, and then we see he wept and embraced his father Jacob when he was able to meet him again. And what is such a beautiful story there, because his father literally thought that he was dead, and now he said that your brother, that Joseph is alive. And what a beautiful story that is. And we see a lot of similarities. And this is just a little bit of a recap here of Joseph and with Jesus. There are a lot of similarities there. There's a lot of things that we can see that coincide and are in agreement with each other about his life and with Christ as well. But we see here that we come to chapter 49, and this is an interesting chapter because we see in verse 28, we're told that Jacob's words were a blessing upon his sons. And in a prophetic sense, they certainly were, for Jacob announced what the Lord had in store for them in the future. And we see that each son, we see this is broken down of how that he spoke to them and taught to them. And there's 3 different types of blessings that are revealed through many of his words. And I shared a few of these here with you on the piece of paper, is that his words were a revelation of human character and conduct. That we see that how they related, how that they had their flaws, how they interacted. But also his words were a great encouragement for what would come. You can almost imagine that when he spoke to them, he would say, okay, listen, here's the blessing. These are things that are to come to your family. But also his words were a revelation of the Messiah. And this is where he actually pointed in these verses, and he pointed to Christ. He referenced in verse 10, Shiloh. Verse 18, salvation, Yeshua, which is of the Lord. The mighty one, the shepherd, and the stone in verse 24. And then the Almighty in verse 25. And we see that this is a pointing to Christ, of what is to come. And we know that Christ would come from this lineage as well. And as he addressed them in this chapter, there's something important to notice, is that Jacob followed the birth order of his sons. And he began with Leah's 6 sons, and then closed with Rachel's 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. So as we look at each one of these sons and we look at what is said, it's important to take notice that yes, they are listed in this way, but also how that some of them had their blessings removed because of things that had happened. So let's look at these, and we're going to, like I said, read through them, and we're going to talk about how each son was related to and how Jacob spoke to them. So let's start here in verse number 1 and verse number 2. And it said, and Jacob called unto his sons, and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Now, something that's interesting here, though, in verse number 1, we often think of that terminology of last days. He's not talking about the end times in speaking of this, but he's talking about that in the last days of him and what would happen with the descendants and with his sons. And then verse number 2, it says, "Gather yourselves together, and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father." So he's gathering them together, and he's saying, "Listen unto me, I am your father. Give me your undivided attention. Give me your time here as I relate to you and I speak to each son about what is to come." So we first see that he speaks to Reuben. So verses 3 and verse number 4. And these are Leah's sons, by the way. "Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defiledest thou it. He went up to my couch." Now, Jacob spoke very directly to Reuben, his eldest son, but what he had to say wasn't very complimentary. It wasn't something of giving him a word of, okay, this is good. But what happens here is an old sin is resurfacing here, and Jacob is talking about. And we know this account because of what had happened in him committing this sexual sin. So an old sin had been committed, and he lost his privileges of being the firstborn. See, he should have been the firstborn. He should have been the one that had this. But then Jacob gave that blessing to Joseph and his two sons. And as Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben should have been a man that was strong, with dignity, and who brought honor to his father and his family. But he turned out to actually be a weak man. And he disgraced his family by defiling his father's bed. And this is what Jacob's talking about here in verse number 4 when he says, "unstable as water." And what does this mean? He's talking about him having a turbulence and a type of weakness. See, water in itself isn't very powerful, but when it has a force, it's like an unstable amount, especially when you see a dam that may break, or you see flooding that takes place. And over the last week or so, we saw a lot of flooding that took place. There were a couple places in Wartburg that people had taken pictures of, and the water was just crazy to see it. But that's what he's talking about. He said that he was unstable as water. He had this turbulent type of attitude. And Reuben's arrogant attitude and reckless way of life were not fitting to be a firstborn son. So you can almost imagine this is not complimentary towards Reuben by the way that Jacob is expressing this to him. But then he goes on here in verses 5 through 7, and he addresses Simeon and Levi. And it says, "Simeon and Levi are brethren. Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, mine honor. Be thou not united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a well. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob, and scatter them in Israel." Now, Reuben's costly sin was lust, because we know what he did by defiling his father's bed. His lust bringeth forth sin, and that's what cost him that. But also, Simeon and Levi were guilty of anger and violence. And this was if you remember back to the unrestrained massacre of the Shechemites. This goes all the way back to Genesis chapter number 34. And it was their right to avenge the rape of their sister Dinah. We remember this. It was a brutal act, and we know that they formed this plan, and they tricked that family that had committed this awful act into believing that they wanted to lock hands and be together.
But here they had another agenda. And they went in and basically massacred everyone that was there. Now, it was their right to avenge them and avenge their sister, yes, but it wasn't necessary to wipe out innocent people just to gratify their own desire for revenge. Oftentimes we call this collateral damage. It's like, well, if we do this, then if they're collected, that's what that represents. But it was not good for them to act in that way. And since it was dangerous to be in their assembly, God arranged that the two tribes would not be able to assemble or do anything together because of what had taken place here. And remember, this is Jacob, and he's being prophetic in talking to them about what would happen down the line with their descendants. And so the tribe of Simeon was eventually absorbed into the tribe of Judah, and the tribe of Levi was given 48 towns to live in, scattered throughout the land. And indeed, the brothers were, according to what Jacob said here, that they would be divided up and scattered in Israel. And that's exactly the way that it happened. So yes, Jacob's being prophetic about this, but he's telling them about what would happen eventually. And then we come to another one of Leah's sons, and this is Judah. Now, as you can imagine, they're there together, they've gathered, and they're hearing each report, each prophetic statement given to each one of the sons. So, Judah here we find in verses 8 through 12. And he said, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies, thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey, my son. Thou art gone up, he stopped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Blinding his foal under the vine, and his ass's colt under the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk. Now, Jacob had paraded the sins of Reuben. He addressed this, okay, of what he had done. And then he brought up the fact about Simeon and Levi. But he had said nothing about Judah's suggestion that the brothers sell Joseph as a slave. Jacob realized now that what Judah did at least saved Joseph's life, where he had intervened and he had spoke to them, and that got him to Egypt. And once again, yes, these were all players in the story, but God's still working behind the scenes and accomplishing His purpose on where everybody was supposed to be. And so we see here that Jacob also said nothing about Judah's sin with Tamar, the sin that was committed there, and that's back in Genesis 38. So it's very easy possibly to speculate here of Jacob's estimation of Judah had gradually risen higher. Now remember, one thing we mentioned about Judah is that people can change. Okay, we made that very clear, that just because a mistake has been made, just because there's sin in the past, there's been mistakes that have been made, does not really define someone for the future, because people's hearts, individuals can change. And so Judah had offered himself as a surety for Benjamin. Remember, he had given the message to loud and clear to Jacob that I am the one to be responsible for Benjamin. Remember that statement that he gave. And surely Joseph had told Jacob about Judah's compassionate plea on behalf of his youngest brother. Remember that passage where we saw just a beautiful imagery of Judah just coming forth and talking about, forgive us, O God, of what we have done. And he wasn't just talking about what was going on in that moment. I believe he was talking about the past and what had happened and their sin that they had committed and how that they had treated Joseph. So when Jacob and the family moved to Egypt, it was Judah whom Jacob sent ahead to make things ready. And Judah, yes, had made some mistakes, but he had also made some things right with his father and his family. And that was the big difference between him and his three elder brothers, is that he had decided to get things right. Remember, people can change. Things change. I've seen some people in the past that have lived pretty wickedly. I've heard testimonies of preachers, evangelists that have stood and given a testimony of their own personal life and seen where that they were to where that they are now. I remember Billy Sunday, a preacher from years and years ago. He has a powerful testimony of where that he was and where that he ended up. And so many others have that same testimony. But never allow a mistake to define you for the rest of your life. There's always, always, always time for reconciliation. There is always, always time to come forth and ask for true repentance and seek that with the Lord so that the Lord can use you there. But this is what he was speaking about here. And also, when you look at the name Judah itself and the Hebrew word for praise, those words are actually very, very similar in how that they are translated. And Judah did eventually, yes, there was those troublesome times early on, but he eventually lived up to his name of praise because of what he chose to do by seeking that repentance and seeking that reconciliation and working things out. What a beautiful imagery there, just a beautiful example of, yes, how people can change. But also we see here in verse number 13, and this is Zebulun. And it says, Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. Now, not much is said there by Jacob to him, but while not directly on the Mediterranean coast, the tribe of Zebulun, the tribe of his descendants, was assigned land close enough to the sea to take transports of goods profitable for all people. And Zebulun was located on an important route that carried merchandise from the coast to the Sea of Galilee and to Damascus. So this is just a little bit of information about him and what Jacob is saying to him. But also here we see Ishkar. This is verses 14 and 15. And it says, Ishkar, is it a strong as couching down between two burdens? And he saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed his shoulder to bear, and became a servant unto tribute. Now, Ishkar was situated at the eastern end of the fertile Jezreel Valley. And this is what we see from the book of Joshua. And this was sandwiched in between Zebulun. Remember, that is the descendants there, Zebulun and the Jordan River. Now, the judge Tola was from Ishkar. This is a judge from the book of Judges that's listed there within that content. And the men of Ishkar fought against Sisera. And David had soldiers. King David had soldiers from that tribe who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And many of the men of this tribe were valiant in battle. And this is what Jacob was speaking to him. Now, of Leah's 6 sons, so there's not much mention about those latter sons there, but of Leah's 6 sons, 3 lost God's blessings because of their sins. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And what does this remind us of? And what can we draw from this? And obviously this is Jacob speaking to them in this narrative and revealing to them and talking to them about what was to come, bringing up things, is that it reminds us that purity and self-control are essential to godly character. Is that if we're going to live after God, there must be a character that we strive to live after. Is that we want to follow after the ways of God. We want to be God-honoring in the things that we do. And when you look at these brothers. When you look at these 12 tribes, when you look at all that has taken place here, yes, you'll see flaws. Yes, you'll see mistakes. But this is quite an excellent reminder that we need to seek purity and self-control in how that we handle ourselves. And Zebulun and Issachar were everyday people, and those were tribes served others but weren't especially known for their exploits. And yes, there wasn't a lot spoken of pertaining to them like the other brothers were, but that's something for us to recognize. So as we see here, that's the first set of brothers that he's given this to, and these are the sons of Leah. And then we come here to chapter or verses 16 through 18, and this lists Bilhah's sons. Now Bilhah was who? This was Rachel's maid, and this was given to Jacob so that she could bear him son, because Rachel at this point in time was childless. And so this handmaid was given unto Jacob so that she could have and he could have these descendants. And the first one that's mentioned here is Dan, and this is verse 16 through 18. It says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heel, so that his rider shall fall backward. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Now the name Dan is actually to judge. And his tribe, now remember these are the tribes of Israel, that his tribe produced one of the most famous judges. Anybody know who that is of this tribe? Samson. Samson came from this tribe. And so it's interesting in the imagery here as well what Jacob does to describe and associate these individuals with. So associating Dan with the serpent, Jacob revealed something about him, about what a serpent is, by using this word, using this imagery of revealing a crafty nature and his habit of making sudden attacks on his enemies. The tribe's conquest of the defenseless people of Laish is an example of their subtle attacks, and their setting up an image in their territory shows they weren't wholly devoted also to the Lord. So yes, there's some issues that lie there, and this is just things that he was revealing and speaking unto them. But here's another son, and this is verse 21. We'll come back to those other verses here in a moment with Gad, because that's Zilpah's son. It says, for some reason, Jacob spoke to Gad and Asher, the sons of Zilpah, before he spoke to Dan's brother, Naphtali. And this tribe's location was north of Zebulun and Issachar and contained the Sea of Galilee. Now, Zebulun and Naphtali were a part of the district called the Galilee of the Gentiles, which was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah and where Jesus ministered. And that Zebulun and Naphtali were distinguished for their bravery in this battle, and we see this from Judges chapter number 5. So those are Bilhah's sons here, but we see that there is another one here, and this was Leah's maid. This is Zilpah's sons. And this is verses 19 through 20, and we come back to those. It says, Gad, a troop, shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. Out of Asher his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. Now, Zilpah was Leah's maid, and this was given to Jacob to bear more children after Leah had ceased from being able to give children. And so later, Leah gave birth to Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah, and this is verses 14 through 21. But let's look here about Gad in verse number 19. His name can mean both good fortune and a troop. And because of the tribe's location on the east side of the Jordan, enemy troops could easily invade their territory. And Jacob assured the Gadites that no conquest would be final, but they would eventually conquer their enemies. Remember what I said in the very beginning, and I know a lot of this we're just talking about prophetic things, talking about what would eventually come to these people groups. But when you look at this, these are words of encouragement. These are words that he was speaking unto them. And then we see here Asher, verse number 20. The word Asher, the name Asher, means blessed or happy. And since the tribe of Asher wasn't able to drive out the inhabitants of their territory, they settled down to be an agricultural people, taking advantage of the fertile land that God had given them. And remember, there was land that God had given to these people groups, and so they settled down to become agricultural people and were blessed to have this because this is what God had intended for them to have, and they worked that land. And here we come here to Rachel's sons. And this is verses 22 through 27. So he's just going individually talking to these sons, these people groups. And so Jacob didn't hesitate to make it known that Rachel was his favorite wife. Now we go back just a little bit and we talk about Leah just for a moment. Remember how that story ended up? He was tricked into taking Leah because he thought he was working for Rachel, but it was said that you shall receive my firstborn. And so we said that the Bible tells us that she was fair to look upon. So the Bible also tells us that Jacob looked at her and despised her in some ways. And so we see that Jacob didn't hesitate to let it be known that Rachel was his favorite wife and that his two sons by her were his favorite children. Now, we know where this leads to because this is why that Jacob was ripped of the coat of many colors and why that he was thrown into the well and why he was sold into slavery is because why? His brothers despised him because of showing that favoritism. And this favoritism caused a great deal of problems in the family, and yet God overruled it to accomplish His own purposes. Now for us at times to look at this story, we're thinking, why in the world did it have to happen this way? But God intended for it to happen in this way and in this manner because He's using all of these situations. He's using all of these predicaments. All of these things were pointing toward Joseph going, yes, to Egypt, and also his family coming to be reunited with him as well in Egypt. And Jacob said more about Joseph than any of the other sons, but he didn't have that much to say about Benjamin, which is quite interesting. So let's look here at verses 22 through 26 as we look first here at Joseph. And he said, Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abided in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From hence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now, just a moment here, just to pause. As you think about these verses here, and he's addressing, remember he's addressing all of them as they have come together and spoken. And so it's very clear that he favors Joseph here. But can you imagine just for a moment where he says the archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him, that the brothers were like, okay, Dad, we know what we did. Maybe like a little bit of a dig possibly of knowing, yes, we know what we did to our brother. We know what happened there in that situation. But his bows abide in strength. Verse number 24. And the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Even by the God of thy father who shall help thee, and by the Almighty who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven, above the blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessing of thy father hath prevailed above the blessings of my promenaders. Under the utmost bond of the everlasting hills, they shall be of the head of Joseph, and of the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. Now remember, they called him Dreamer. And he said to his brothers that you will bow before me. And going back just a little bit into our past, with what we talked about already with Joseph, we know that his brothers did come before him and they bowed. Even though they didn't know they were bowing to Joseph, they came before him and they bowed in appearance. But we see here that Jacob is speaking to Joseph, and he's declared unto him that the God of Jacob, the God that has promised, the God that has led me, the God that has made all these promises, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, has had His hand upon Joseph and has taken care of him, has delivered him. And what a beautiful imagery that he's expressing here. But it's very clear, it's very evident how he favored Joseph and he loved his son. And then we see here, verse 27, it says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf in the morning, he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Now, you would expect Jacob to say more to and about his youngest son Benjamin, the son of his right hand, but his words were few, and actually it's quite puzzling at times with the imagery that he uses here. Why do you think he would compare Benjamin to a raven wolf? Or you could say ravening wolf, a raven wolf. Why do you think that would be their type of an imagery? Any idea? Well, you have to know about the tribe, how the descendants were as well. I think that the men of Benjamin were brave, and just a little bit of history here, this may give us a clearer picture of this. Let's look at this. The men of Benjamin were brave and helped defeat Sisera. This is in the book of Judges. But when you read Benjamin's tribal history in Judges 19, chapter 19 and chapter 20, you see the raven wolf in action. Remember, what's Jacob doing here? What's he telling them? What is to come? And this is why this imagery is given here, and why these words are used to describe him. Think about this. Saul, the first king of Israel, was from what tribe? Benjamin. Now, he was like a ravenous wolf, wasn't he? During his career, he more than once tried to kill David. I mean, even his own son, Jonathan, told David of the plot and went against his father to try to save the life of his best friend, David. He did everything that he could. And we know what happened with Jonathan and Saul. Eventually, they both died. But also we know that during his, he ruthlessly murdered everybody in the priestly city of Nob. We know this about Saul. Other Benjamites known as their ferocity were Abner in 2 Samuel, Sheba in chapter 20, and Shimei in chapter 16. Saul of Tarsus, a Benjamite, was like a wild animal when he did what? When he persecuted the church. So we're going all the way back to where Jacob spoke these words to young Benjamin. Young Benjamin thinking, who, me? You know, I'm the young one. I'm the baby here. Who, me? This is me. But he spoke this. And this was of God coming forth of saying that Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. And we know what Saul did as he acted like a wild animal when he persecuted the early church. He was one that stood and held the coats of those who stoned Stephen as being the first martyr of the church. And we know that he tracked down Christians. He imprisoned them. He wanted them to die. And then finally, on the road to Damascus, Jesus forever changed his life. And from that day forward, he became not an enemy of the cross and of Christ, but he became, as we know, the greatest preacher to have ever lived, the Apostle Paul, as he preached the message. But interesting here that Jacob gave this imagery of what would come from his descendants. And so the brothers are all gathered together here. And yes, some of them, there's not much spoken of. We can look through the scriptures. There's a lot more talking about their descendants, how all things took place, how that their lands were divided, how things happened in the history of Israel. If you want to look at an interesting story about Israel, just look at the civil war between the northern and southern kingdom and how all of that developed. And that would take a long time to really dissect and get into. But there were issues there with leadership and a history of the nation of Israel rejecting the message that the prophets had given to them from God. And because of that rejected message, we saw that they were in captivity. Many times, God used wicked and heathen kings to put them under subjection so that they would hear from God and understand where that they were and where that they had messed up. So we come back here to Jacob. And so all the sons are together here in verses 28 through 33. And here we see a sort of closing statement here of what he's giving about his death. Sort of like the last words, his last will and testament of what he wants to see happen. And like I mentioned last week with Joseph, and we see from that passage, when he saw Joseph, he had some time with him, yes, but he said, I have seen my son, and now I can die. I can die. And so, verse 28 tells us, and he charged them and said unto them, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron and the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place, to be buried with his descendants. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The purchase of the field and of the cave that is therein was from the children of Heth. And when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he had said all he needed to say. He had spoken to each individual son. He had talked to them about what was to come as being in his lineage and their lineage and what was to come and what had happened and the result of their sins and those blessings being removed of those one sons of Leah. And he gathered up his feet into the bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered unto his people. You know, I've read this before, that last verse there in 33. And he gathered up his feet into the bed. Now, I don't know, because I've never died. And I don't know if anybody in here has died and then came back. I only know a few that's done that and lived to tell the story. But I've heard stories of people's accounts of people that have died in history. And one in particular, you probably know him by the name of Wyatt Earp, and also of his notorious person that helped him, who is Doc Holliday. Doc Holliday, it's recorded that when he died, he was laying in the bed with Wyatt Earp by his side. And Wyatt Earp spoke. They were good friends. Many people think, why in the world was Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday friends? Well, apparently years and years ago, Wyatt Earp had saved Doc Holliday's life. And that's why Doc Holliday helped him fight at the OK Corral. If you're into history, it's a pretty neat story there of how all that came to be. But it's said that while Wyatt Earp was there, Doc Holliday's last words were, he wiggled his toes and he said, "This is funny." And then he died on his deathbed. And as I've read this passage talking about how that he gathered up his feet into the bed, is that, who knows? I mean, like I said, I've not died, but maybe it's your toes you feel first going out, and then it's like completely, I don't know. I'm just saying that because of what Doc Holliday said, that, and then Wyatt Earp recorded there. But here we see that it says that he got up into the bed, in his feet into the bed, and yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people. And here we see the last words and testament here of the death of Jacob. And the statements that Jacob made to each one of his sons would be remembered by them, and I think would be repeated
of their family for years and years to come. And as time passed, they would see new and deeper meanings of these pronouncements. Things that started to happen. And they thought, Dad said that. I remember this. I remember what took place there. They would treasure the assurances that Jacob had spoken to them. Remember the assurances that Jacob had given about the blessings, the descendants, the things that would happen here, the reassurance, okay? But also the last words of Jacob were about himself and not about his sons. For he wanted them to do something. And you know, a last will and testament is very important. It says, for he wanted them to guarantee that they would bury him in the cave of Machpelah, where the bodies of 5 members of their family were now resting. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to, Kendra's family has like a cemetery that's on their land. It's a real small cemetery, and a lot of family members are buried in that cemetery. And I believe almost everybody that's buried there, to my knowledge, is connected in family in some way. But a lot of rural areas, a lot of homes that have been around for hundreds of years, sometimes there are cemeteries on the lands, and those small cemeteries are families that have been buried together here, and they want that. That's very meaningful. And so we see here that this was a place where he wanted his sons to bury him. And in the cave of Machpelah, where the bodies of 5 members of his family were now resting. Abraham had purchased the cave as a burial for Sarah. Okay? But over the years, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah had been buried there, and now Jacob wanted to join them. And he said, this is important to me. This is something that I want you to do. Now, he'd already spoken about this matter to Joseph. If you look back at chapter number 47, you see what he said there. So he knew his request would be followed, but he wanted all of his sons to know they had the responsibility of obeying his last commands and showing respect to their father. But also, this closes a chapter within this book and in this life, because Jacob's long and difficult, yes, at times, troublesome times. Remember, Jacob wrestled with everybody. You know, Jacob would have been a great wrestler, a professional wrestler. He wrestled with many people in his relationships with them. His father-in-law, he wrestled with God. He wrestled with many people that he encountered, okay? Wrestled with many people. And it was difficult. But even though it was difficult, he reflected back on his life and he realized, even though I've not always been faithful to God, God's still been faithful to me. And we've seen a lot of that in his life. And he made this his last journey. This was his last blessing. And shared his last request. His work was done. He breathed his last breath and he died. With only his staff, he had crossed over Jordan many years before, but now he had his staff with him as he crossed to the other side. And he literally, just like he had explained earlier on in a previous chapter, he was a pilgrim on a journey. And like each one of us, we're pilgrims in this life. And we're strangers to this place because this isn't our home. This is only a short-term visitation, because we shouldn't act like this is our permanent home, because our permanent home should be heaven. That's what we long for. That's what we want to embrace. And so we see here with Jacob, he made it very clearly to say, honor my last requests. Here's my blessing. Sons, this journey, my pilgrimage is done here. And he passed away. And his sons had experienced a lot. Think about this. Over this period of time, all that had happened, their father thinking their son Joseph was dead, given the news that he is alive. Jacob never thinking he'd see his son Joseph again, and he probably thought he would die and never see Joseph. But being able to see Joseph, what a blessing that was. And he closed this here, chapter number 49, and he gave them this message. And I've heard of people doing that before, like where they almost time. I'll never forget, there was a pastor that passed away over in Blount County, and it's interesting about the church he pastored. He pastored the same church for like over 50 years. And the building, he paid for the building to be built. Pastored the same church. Well, he knew he was going to pass away. I think he had cancer or something, and he gave a sermon and videoed it. And at the service, there wasn't a funeral service like a preacher preaching. He preached, they showed the video of him preaching, and he wanted to preach his own funeral from the video that he had recorded. And he gave an account of his life. He talked about how the Lord had blessed him, how many people had impacted him, and he just was thankful that the Lord had given him the opportunity to reach so many people for Jesus. I'd never seen anybody do that before, but that was interesting for sure. But they played it, and he preached it, and he gave, at the end of the video, he gave a call for people to be saved. And I can't remember, it's been so long since that happened, but I think of this like that, just a closing statement of saying, this is my life, this is what I want to happen, this is what's to happen to you, it's my time to depart. Interesting, isn't it? What a closing picture here. Yes, Jacob had a lot of problems, he had a lot of issues, but I think he put a bow on it at the end, telling them and then declaring to them what's to happen, and that my work is done. And then we know chapter 50, we'll talk about that next week, but that's about mourning their father, which they would. I mean, his work was done, but they mourned for him. And they cried because we're going to miss people here on this earth, yes, when they go on to be with the Lord, but we have the promise of being able to see him again. That's the promise that we have. And what a way to finish this up here. Interesting, chapter 49. A delivering message to each one, and then he sums it up on his last request, and then he says, I'm finished. I'm done. Anybody with a thought on that? Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. 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 They thought, I'll show you. Yeah. And you know that coat of many colors, like it's really hard for us to imagine what that may have looked like, but I'm sure he stood out in a crowd. Absolutely. I mean, you could pick him out. Sort of like someone that wears a neon shirt in the crowd. I mean, you can pick them out. That's why when you see kids and things, when they take field trips to like Dollywood or wherever, everybody's wearing the same shirt, and they make for certain it's either the ugliest shirt or it's the brightest shirt, so they can spot them all out and know where they're at. So, but it's just, it's interesting though, and even through that, they were terrified of how Joseph would respond, but Joseph responded in a graceful manner. I mean, you think about it. Look at this. Remember I said the imagery between Jesus and the connection with Joseph? What did Jesus say on the cross? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then here with Joseph, it had been very easy for him to have condemned his brothers and said, listen, look what you did to me. You deserve a just punishment. But he didn't. He showed them grace. And I'm thankful that because of my sin that nailed Christ to the cross, God has shown me grace. I'm thankful that he's extended grace to me by Jesus. And that's the only way that grace and forgiveness comes, is by the blood of Christ. That's the only way. And so, excellent as you look at this. If you ever want to do a good study, like a deep study, just look at Joseph's life and look at Jesus' life and look at the comparisons that you see there. There's a lot of good comparisons there you can see. Anybody else with a thought? each one of these sons he spoke to, that what I mentioned is only like a tip of the iceberg of what eventually happened down through their lineage of what happens with their descendants. I mean, each one had their descendants that continued on in the lineage, and but he just touches on them and gives a pronouncement to each one of them, and does this, like I said, before he passes. All right, we've made it this far. We got one more. I promise we'll be done. Okay. Hopefully you've liked it. If not, I don't know what to tell you. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed walking through it and rereading and studying. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. And we'll start something new. But next Wednesday, like I said, it'll be our last one for Genesis, and we'll close that book. And then we'll pray about what's next of what to study. All right, let's go ahead and let's stand, and we'll dismiss, okay? Trey, would you like to pray for us? Yeah, sure. Okay. Ryan, you okay? Pray for us. Okay.
Lord, I want to thank you for another opportunity to gather here and learn and grow in knowledge of you. I ask that you put your hand on those that need it, and those that have lost someone, and those that are going through trials. Keep us safe as we travel home, and all these things I pray. Amen.
Amen.